Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today on day one plenary session for the All Energy and Energy Efficiency Virtual Conference for 2021. My name is Robbie Clark and I'm the Portfolio Director at RX Global Australia, and I oversee the Energy Waste and Recycling event portfolio. I begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, which is virtually in our homes and workplaces all around the country, and I pay my respects to the elders past and present. Personally, I'm calling in from Balgowlah in the beautiful Gurungai country in the northern beaches of Sydney, and as such, I'd like to recognise the Gurungai mob for their continuing connection to the land and waters, and thank them for protecting this beautiful coastline and its ecosystems since time immemorial. Well, for 2 years running now, we've had to sadly cancel our live events, normally taking place in 1 week's time in Melbourne. This has been particularly challenging for my team, so I'd like to sincerely thank all my work colleagues for their persistence and resilience over the last 2 years. I do promise you that we will be back with a vengeance in 2022. On a very positive note for you, the delegate today, we have put together this comprehensive 2-week conference agenda so you don't miss out. A big thank you to our valued partners, the Clean Energy Council and the Energy Efficiency Council, for all your input and guidance in pulling together this extensive educational program. You're not here to hear from me, but you're here to hear from the experts. So to get the ball rolling, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our chair for today's plenary session, Kane Thornton. Kane is the Chief Executive of the Clean Energy Council, the peak body for the renewable energy and energy storage industry in Australia. Kane has more than a decade's experience in energy policy and leadership in the development of renewable energy industry. Kane has advocated for and helped design the policies that have been critical to the renewable energy industry's growth, and continues to be an active political advocate, public presenter and media spokesperson. Kane, I'm handing the keys over to you to start today's plenary session titled A Pathway to Net Zero, a subject that couldn't be more timely. Kane.
Thanks very much, Robbie, and good morning and welcome. Robbie, to you and your team, firstly, congratulations and thank you. It's been a tough couple of years. I know historically the event had some 10,000 people attending in person. We can't wait for 2022 where we get back in person. But as you said, we've got a fantastic program both here this morning and also over the next couple of weeks to really engage, and the timing couldn't be better. The national debate is, I was going to say is alive and well. It's certainly alive in terms of our journey towards net zero. The transition of the energy sector is in full swing, and there's so much to talk about, which will be the topic of today's session. COVID-19 has obviously had an enormous impact globally and right across Australia, and I wanted to just recognise the challenges it's created for everyone and hope everyone is staying safe and staying sane. It's a hard time to manage mental health and well-being, and encourage everyone to pay attention to that as best you can. The saying everyone's well familiar with, change happens gradually, then all of a sudden, and that feels incredibly pertinent to the moment we're in right now here in Australia. 2021 has turned out to be a year of enormous change, an enormous transition in the energy sector. It's truly reached warp speed. Rural towns right across Australia are seeing the positive impact of rapid deployment of large-scale renewable energy and now energy storage, creating jobs, creating economic opportunity in these towns otherwise struggling. Australians have embraced solar power to the tune of almost 3 million homes and are now rapidly taking up residential household-scale battery storage. Power prices are trending down, emissions have fallen, at least in the electricity sector, and the country now begins to imagine itself as a clean energy superpower. Pretty exciting times. But climate and clean energy politics and policy remains a mess. The states, businesses, households are all leading, but unfortunately the federal government remains stuck in the past. What we've seen, particularly this week, is that much has changed. as all Australians now start to imagine a renewable energy future. And this is something that the Clean Energy Council's recent campaign, Renewable Energy is Here Now, has helped to support. Over 5 million Australians now have seen the campaign and now understand the benefits of renewable energy. I think for far too long, our industry has been preaching to the converted. And so we've taken our campaign to cautious Australians. It's been running on platforms like Sky TV and in conservative newspapers right around the country. And I thought we should take a quick look at just one of the ads now.
Yeah, but as if that battery's going to make that much difference.
Well, it's going to save us some money. And when the sky's black and the bushfires are rushing in, that battery's going to help us save lives. Nearly 30% of Australia's power is renewable, and how soon? It's going to be 50. Yeah, but...
No more yeah buts. Renewable energy is here now.
As I said, over 5 million Australians have now seen that ad, and it's a message that I think is now being echoed by many very influential voices right across Australia. We've seen people like Twiggy Forrest all in on renewable hydrogen and clean energy. We've seen the Business Council of Australia now getting on board. We've seen News Corporation launching their Mission Zero campaign. So there's much speculation about the fate of our nation and the state of politics at this wonderful session today. It'll be the hot topic of discussion. And to get the ball rolling, it's fantastic to be joined by the Honourable Lily D'Ambrosio MP. She is the Minister for Energy, Environment and Climate Change and Minister for Solar Homes here in Victoria. She's a member of the Australian Labor Party and has represented the electorate of Mill Park in the Victorian Legislative Assembly since 2002. In 2016, she became the Minister for Energy, Environment and Climate Change. And on the return of the Andrews Labor government, she was appointed Minister for Energy, Environment, Climate Change and Minister for Solar Homes. She's a strong advocate and a true friend of the clean energy transition. The Minister joined me yesterday morning for this interview, so let's hear from her now. Well, Minister D'Ambrosio, good morning to you, and thank you for joining us at All Energy 2021. I have to start, being a Melburnian, as a you, some pretty big news for Melbourne and Victoria over the weekend in terms of COVID restrictions. A bit of a spring in your step this morning.
I think there's a spring in everybody's step here in Victoria, Kane. Victorians have done a fantastic job. We're really leading the charge in terms of first dose vaccinations, and certainly we're moving really quickly to that second dose critical vaccination point to enable us to get out of lockdown. And so it's all fantastic, but of course people are still being very cautious, applying the rules, following the rules, and that's what's got us here this far, and it'll get us through to a fantastic position, certainly at Christmas time when we can all get together with family and friends.
Great, yeah, absolutely. I know for the renewable energy industry, it's certainly in Victoria and those in Melbourne, particularly the solar industry, it's been a tough year or two, so I know everyone's looking forward to getting back to some normality. The other topic that's obviously dominating headlines at the moment is climate policy. The federal government obviously going through a fairly excruciating process to revise their climate policy. What are your expectations? We've had confirmation now that the Prime Minister will go to Glasgow. What does he need to take to be credible? What's your expectations of where the government will land?
Well, what should have happened a long time ago is an absolute commitment to net zero emissions by 2050 and a very, very strong target to 2030. Now, so I think the federal government still needs to demonstrate that these attempts about what 2050 needs to look like is more about saving Scott Morrison's political skin than doing what is right for Australians as a whole, and in terms of our economic prosperity and future. And of course, the way we're perceived globally is really important here, of course. We like to think ourselves as a national leader in so many respects, but we're a big F for fail when it comes to tackling climate change and, of course, pushing through on that very, very strong renewable energy that we need to see become the dominant feature of our energy system here in Australia.
Yeah, it'll be fascinating to see where things get to over the couple of weeks. I must say some somewhat concerning signals from the Nationals in particular, and I think it's a sad state that a small number of people in a minority political party can hold the nation to ransom essentially on climate policy. It's a sad state, isn't it?
Well, leadership is important here, and the fact is the federal government has failed leadership to demonstrate any leadership, whether it's their minority partner or indeed the main part of the coalition government. There's been a major failure now for too many years, and good leadership requires them to push ahead. So that's the test here, and also the test will be is what they say about 2030, because that's the next critical point. And it's also, of course, unlocking so many job opportunities right across the country that we can all benefit from.
You're not standing still here in Victoria. You're not sitting around waiting. Can you share a bit of your perspective on how you're seeing the sort of energy transition playing out in Victoria at the moment? What's working really well? You know, what do you see as the next wave of challenges that you're focused on?
Well, we know that strong policy requires certainty for industry so that they can plan, they can bring forward their projects with some confidence that the government's got their back and that they will provide a really strong and a very strong and flourishing economic environment and policy environment for them to be able to build their projects. And we've seen that here in Victoria. So since 2014, we were just over 10% of our energy coming from renewable sources. We've now broken the 30% barrier, and that's way overshot our commitment for 25% renewable energy by 2020. Last summer, we saw an additional just over 1,000 megawatts of new renewable energy connected to the grid. This coming summer, we will be seeing a further 1,500 megawatts connected, providing much needed clean energy to our system. All of these fantastic. The number of benefits that come from that. Victoria, just yourselves, the Clean Energy Council came last year, reported that Victoria was leading the country in terms of jobs growth in the renewable energy sector. We aim to keep it that way. We certainly know that there's a lot more to be done, but it's about what you get when you have policy certainty mixed in with, importantly, the government prepared to invest itself to help industry get that really important kickstart. And that's exactly what they've got from our government. Since we were elected just about 6 years ago, more needs to happen, more will happen. And we only have to point to our VRET 2 auction as a really important testimony to our commitment and on our ongoing commitment to this space.
Yeah, we'll come back and talk a bit more about VRET 2 and some of those grid and infrastructure challenges that I know you're very focused on. But just to segue across to rooftop solar, again, record levels of deployment of rooftop solar. We've seen the success of the Solar Homes program, and now it playing a broadened role. I think really good focus on low income and rental accommodation, SMEs. Now playing a role supporting electric vehicle take up. What's your assessment of how we're going as far as that sort of rooftop household space and what next from government's perspective?
Thank you. Well, our Solar Homes program was effectively one of the key planks of our re-election campaigning going back to the end of 2018, and people resoundingly voted for that. By 2025, we anticipate about 1 million Victorians will have solar panels on their roofs. Some, of course, will have more solar hot water systems, battery storage. We've upped our support for that. This really tells you that when you work through a transition, a transformation of a particular sector, and the energy sector is the one case in point here, so you need to be able to take communities with us. And that is a really important lesson. So through these programs that have been very much, which have made these technologies very, very accessible to those who can least afford it, plus those in the middle, the take-up has been extraordinary. It's very much surpassed our own expectations. But it just tells people this is how, that you can actually feel the transition, you can feel and benefit from the transition, not just, of course, for you and your family and your hip pocket, but it's also important, of course, being a part of the change in terms of climate change. So these things are possible. It just shows that you can create thousands of jobs too. Solar Homes is creating 5,500 jobs just in that program alone. So we've got the right recipe in place, and Victorians have overwhelmingly embraced that.
Yeah, here they certainly have. Can we just go back to your reference to VRET? Obviously, VRET was incredibly successful and popular as a first round. VRET 2 now underway. Where's it up to? What are your expectations, and what comes next as far as VRET 2?
Well, VRET 2, of course, comes on the back of the extremely popular first VRET auction, where we went to the market seeking 650 megawatts of new projects. We ended up sealing the deals for projects that were worth over 900, just under 1,000 megawatts. So enthusiastic was the market for this. VRET 2, I anticipate, will be no different in terms of the amount of eager applications coming through. And thus far, of course, we are very much on track to deliver that in the time frame that we've set. So contracts signed by next year, and projects are being built out by 2025. I do want to say that this round of auction is a little bit different in that we've also coupled that with our commitment as a state government to power all of government operations by 100% renewable energy, and that's by 2025. We will be the first jurisdiction in the country to make that commitment, number one, and number two, follow that up. And that's about leadership, leading by example, and we're absolutely delighted, and I'm really thrilled that we've been able to land this. But that comes on the back, of course, us powering our solar trams, the biggest tram network in the world. More than 400 trams powered by renewable energy. We were in a very, very successful certificate scheme for that project going back now about 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, I mean, governments, well, in Victoria and right around the country and the world have so much purchasing power. It's great to see you putting that to really good use. And I think it's very iconic, our tram network being 100% renewable powered. So congratulations on that one. We're almost out of time, but I did want to touch on the grid issues. I mean, as we know, particularly for utility scale investors, the grid's been the single biggest challenge. And, you've really stepped up, I think, with the commitment to VicGrid. Obviously the REZ, the renewable energy zones, are a really important part of bringing infrastructure together, making sure that these projects get the coordination they need in the right parts of Victoria. How do you see the progress as far as the grid, the REZs, and the role for VicGrid?
Well, certainly we made the commitment to VicGrid and the grid infrastructure, $540 million. That was the single largest investment in transmission infrastructure of any jurisdiction in the country. And that was part of a $1.6 billion investment about a budget and a half ago from our government, including a lot of energy efficiency initiatives also. So it's the single biggest investment of any state government ever in energy efficiency, but also, of course, infrastructure. We know, of course, that infrastructure, transmission infrastructure, is a major constraint on investor confidence, but also, of course, the actual reality of being able to connect fully to the grid. And that will pay, of course, the impact of that is a dampening effect on investor confidence. And that is something that we want to absolutely remove as a bottleneck. Investor confidence is so important here, and that's why not just identifying it as a problem, but also backing it with some significant investment is really critical. So we're working through the various proposals that have come to us. We've consulted on a lot of those, and we're moving ahead with those. And we'll keep working with business, industry, AEMO to do that. The important thing is that that money will help us activate every single one of our 6 renewable energy zones. And that is really critical here, because we know that no matter where you live in Victoria, there are so many direct benefits that can come your way and have come the way of regional communities for these investments in new energy technologies.
Right, thank you, Minister. We are almost out of time, but I can't let you go until I hear your views on Australia and Victoria's potential as a global clean energy superpower. This is a topic that's, I think really captured the nation's attention. Some of our biggest industries and business leaders really throwing their weight and throwing their money behind it. What's the opportunity for Victoria to be a part of the massive renewable export industry?
Well, look, that is a very exciting area that we're very committed to. We know, of course, that at a national level, there's been a lot of conversation around, for example, hydrogen, and I'm very keen and committed to ensuring that Victoria positions itself extremely well, so that we can continue to have the shingle on the door which says that Victoria is open to global investment. And global players that want to come here, knowing that you will have a strong government that has ambition, number one, in terms of what our targets will be for clean energy, and we've got very strong ones for 2030. We don't aim to stop there, of course, but importantly that we will have the right policies in place, the right infrastructure in place to enable you to come forward. So there's a lot of work underway. There's further work happening in terms of the green hydrogen space that I'll look forward to saying more about in the not too distant future. But also importantly, the next big challenge for us to crack globally, but in particular here in Victoria, is what do we do about natural gas? What is the substitute? What are the alternatives to cracking that? Because for us to meet our climate change initiatives, our climate change objectives, we need those solutions coming forward. Some of those solutions are there already, electrification, but also what is the role that energy efficiency plays in that, and importantly, of course, green hydrogen. So you will know, Kane, and your members will know that we've got a gas substitution roadmap that we've got under development. We've gone out with a paper on that. We'll have more to say on that, and no one should be in any doubt that Victoria will remain not just a national leader in terms of the export potential for clean energy, but of course an international player, a very serious player, and a serious international leader.
Minister, we are out of time. Thank you for your time this morning, but more importantly, thank you for your leadership. I think you've demonstrated clearly your own passion and commitment to a transition to clean energy, and obviously Victoria as a state leading the way. So thanks very much for your time this morning, and all the very best.
Thank you.
Yeah, great showcase of the leadership of Victoria, and an energy minister who is now the most experienced energy minister serving across the country, and I think that's very clear in her depth and breadth of knowledge of the portfolio. So wonderful to have Minister D'Ambrosio join us. We're now going to head to a more national perspective. It's a great honour to have the Honourable Chris Bowen join us next. Chris entered Parliament in 2004. He's held a wide range of portfolios, including serving as Treasurer, Minister for Human Services and Minister for Tertiary Education. He's been responsible for a wide range of significant policy reform programs across these portfolios. And as we know, he is now the Shadow Minister for Climate Change and Energy. Chris joined me late last week at what is a pretty extraordinary moment in time in our national debate about climate and energy politics. We had a lot to talk about. So let's now hear from Chris Bowen, and a special guest cameo appearance from his pet Labradors. Chris Bowen, welcome to All Energy 2021. Thanks for joining us today. There's a lot to talk about. There's certainly an incredible amount going on in climate change and clean energy policy across the country. But I want to start with a question to you, really. It's been a challenging last 12 months for people right around the globe, right across Australia. And I know, your electorate's been pretty significantly impacted by by COVID. How are you doing? How are the people in your electorate doing? And what are the impacts for Australia more generally?
Well, thanks very much, Kane, and thanks for the invitation to join you. And I'm actually joining you from my Bowen's backyard, here in Smithfield in Western Sydney. So I've got two Labradors who might make a guest appearance at some point during this Zoom. And I live on a main road, so you might hear a bit of traffic. But look, it has been tough for my community. We've been the epicentre of the outbreak in southwest Sydney. Of course, it started with an outbreak out of the airport in Bondi, but it got to Western Sydney, and we copped the brunt of it. And there's been a lot of fear in the community about COVID. A lot of elderly people been very concerned at various points. A lot of economic dislocation. After this, I'm going off to our weekly food hamper canteen that we run with Oz Harvest. We'll give out 1,000 food hampers this afternoon. We do every Thursday. Lockdown is sort of coming to an end, but people are still, this is a long way out. It's going to be a long way to go. And so that's been it's been very full on in the community. So between balancing, climate change policy and community work as the MP, I've had my hands full, but luckily the family's all good. I'm very grateful. Our daughter's in year 11. I'm grateful she's not in year 12, and our son's in year 8. And I think the sort of ones with really little kids at primary school who aren't yet sort of self-managing, and year 12 we're doing it tough. We're in a bit of a sweet spot with our kids. We've struck it a bit lucky, I hope.
Great. Oh, good to hear. It's certainly been a challenging period. Tough period to take on a new portfolio. You've been in it for sort of heading towards 12 months now. Your reflections on the energy transition in Australia, how are we going? What are your insights and impressions as to how as a country we're managing the inevitable transition?
So, it was January I took over, so I guess that's 10 months, but before you know it, it'll be 12. Look, I really think as a country we're very patchy, and that just really shows the frustration about how much better we could be doing with the right policy framework, with a little bit of leadership. States are getting on with it, Labor and Liberal. Now big business is increasingly getting on with it, as we've seen rather spectacularly the last few days, but more than that, actual businesses have been getting on with it. Local government's getting on with it, doing great jobs. Households are getting on with it. 1 in 4 houses have rooftop solar. But, all that is a small proportion of what we could be doing with the right national framework and strategy. More petajoules of solar power hit our landmass than any other country in the world. Our above average wind. The sky's the limit in terms of potential. I think we are doing okay when it comes to renewable energy installations, although, we've got a lot of frustrations with the grid and with connecting new installations to the grid, and how slow that is in many instances, and how that chills investment. But the real challenge to the country is, I think basically everybody knows what to do with the renewables. The real challenge, but I see it as an opportunity, is storage, building the batteries, the hydro, the hydrogen and the pumped hydro capacity, because that's the real key to unlocking the puzzle, because we've got to care about reliability and storage, and batteries are great for the shorter periods. We need the longer periods of storage. That really requires a big government framework, and the trouble is at the moment you've still got a government arguing about the basics, that whether you've still got some climate change deniers, and I don't say that lightly. You've got some self-professed climate change deniers on the government side of the chamber, and it doesn't take many to veto good policy. And we've just seen now, who knows what happens when this broadcast goes to your conference on Tuesday, but as we speak on Thursday, the country's still not committed to net zero by 2050, and even if they get there by Tuesday, the fact that we're having this conversation so late, 5 minutes to midnight, is just a terrible indictment, and we're just missing out on so many opportunities. With the right government, the right policy framework, we could be doing so much better.
What's your assessment? I mean, there's been some real tectonic shifts in the last couple of weeks. If you look at some of the action of people like Twiggy Forrest in really driving and delivering on the big bold promises around renewable hydrogen, we've seen the BCA. Have you described that finally shifting their position, and a pretty significant intervention? We've seen, News Corporation really shift and launch a campaign. How do you look at all that? What's the level of cynicism? Because all those, some of those players have played a pretty big role in stopping action historically. But what's your assessment of all of that, and And therefore, where will government get to, do you think, in that very different context?
Well, look, I mean, we are entitled to express frustration that these guys have come to the party so late. That BCA is very late arriving to the party. In 2019, they said 45% would wreck the economy with not a jot of modelling or work or, analysis. It was just what I call a lazy tweet. And that's pretty disappointing. But I choose to focus on the fact that they've arrived. We can be annoyed that it's taken so long to arrive at the party, but they've turned up at the party, maybe late, but they've bought a bottle of wine and, here they are at the party. But in all seriousness, that it all helps, because what we can't do is be complacent and say, oh, well, now, News Limited's, vaguely on board and, the BCA's on board. It's all just going to be easy sailing. It's not. We're still going to be dealing with Clive Palmer's millions, and he's a climate change denier. And he's a charlatan and all that sort of stuff, but he's not a bad marketing director for a pretty dishonest, fundamentally completely dishonest campaign with a lot of money behind it. And while the government's divided and dysfunctional at the moment on all the basics, what they will unite around is a scare campaign at the election. And the modern liberals no less than the others, the alleged modern liberals no less than the others. Some of the people who are now cloaking themselves as sort of progressive modern liberals have engaged in the scare campaign with alacrity in the past. Josh Frydenberg ran the scare campaign against the climate change action in the last election. Dave Sharma bagged electric vehicles and made fun of them. Trent Zimmerman's recommended the Zali-Steggall bill not even be voted on or debated in the parliament. Tim Wilson, who's now joined the executive, called for us to leave Kyoto. I mean, these guys will participate in the scare campaign against Labor and progressive action. Now, none of that reduces our level of ambition or our determination to go to the people with a strong climate change policy. But it does mean that we're very alive to how we have to really focus on explaining and batting away the fear campaign, etc. And that's the challenge for us over the coming weeks and months. I believe we're competitive in the election. I believe we can win the election. I believe we can win it with a very, very ambitious climate change policy, but I don't underestimate the size of the task. So PCA and those other developments, News Limited, does that help? Sure it does, but we've got a long way to go yet.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. You've done a great job, I think, of the narrative that you've been prosecuting about the economic opportunity, particularly out in regions and traditional coal regions and heavy industry. Clearly, we know there's a transition, and that's going to be challenging, but we know there's opportunity, and particularly, I guess, this renewable hydrogen piece. Can you talk a bit? I mean, particularly the export opportunity and this narrative around Australia being a renewable energy superpower. What's your sort of insight as to that opportunity?
We just had Toby the Labrador shake the table, but anyway, that's real life television, folks. There we go.
That's right. We're coming live. It's good to meet the Labradors. But the global clean energy superpower concept. I mean, what's your sense of how real that is, and what as a nation we need to do to make sure that we are the superpower? Because it's a competitive field.
Absolutely, it's real. I mean, superpower is it a slogan? Sure, but is it a slogan with a lot of substance? Absolutely. The capacity is there. I believe we can be 100% renewable economy and then a 700% renewable economy, because what we've got to remind ourselves, Kane, is that we're an energy export nation. What we've got to remind ourselves is we're not a coal and gas export nation alone. We export energy. It's a bit like Kodak, who thought that they were a film company when really they were an image and memory company. They forgot that they were an image and memory company. They focused on film. As film disappeared, they disappeared. We are an energy export country, and we can continue to be. We can continue to do that. We can export renewable energy through hydrogen. We can export it through submarine cables, Sun Cable being the most spectacular example of that. And these are all real examples of what we can do. We have more petajoules hit our land mass than any other country in the world. We have above average wind. And we live on the edge of a region which is constrained. Singapore is going to struggle with their renewable energy because they don't have the space for the big renewable energy installations that we have. So there's great synergy there. So absolutely we can be a renewable energy superpower with an export energy focus of renewable energy. And that's why that's why we have reframed the debate, because it's real. I think, Kane, we've won the case of morality of action on climate change. We've won that. We've won it multiple times. We've won the case that it's our international obligation to act on climate change. Collectively, we've all won that multiple times. What we haven't won is the case that action on climate change is in our country's best interest. That's what we haven't won. And that's why, frankly, my side of politics keeps losing elections, because we haven't won that argument. So that's why we have reframed the debate and focused with a laser-like approach on why acting on climate change is good for Australia, because that's what Australian voters want to know. If you're voting because it's our international obligation, you're already sort of basically on board for a change of government. But if you're voting on what's in our country's best interest, you've got to be convinced that action on climate change is in our country's best interest. So we've got a task to convince them. So that's why basically whenever you hear me speak, you'll hear me out of the words, the world's climate emergency is Australia's jobs opportunity, because it is. But we've got to give people the positive, uplifting, optimistic view of the future. Some people say in forums, I'll just declare a climate emergency and people will get it. With respect, people have got enough to worry about, enough doom and gloom in their lives, enough challenges. If you just talk about a climate emergency, they're going to say, oh, yeah, that's all a bit pessimistic, thanks. They're going to talk about, hello, Ollie. They're going to talk about, they want to hear the positive message for the future, and that requires us laser-like talking about the jobs opportunities for Australia.
Yep. You're demonstrating that laser-like focus while you're being constantly interrupted by a Labrador. Chris, we're almost out of time, but you're obviously well entitled to critique the government's policies or lack of. But I guess we're interested in the ALP's positions. Can you just give us a bit of a quick sense of what we can expect in the lead up to the election? 2030 target is obviously something that you haven't put a stake in the ground in. What else can we expect the ALP to reveal in the lead up to the election, whenever that might be?
Well, actually, we've announced more climate change policy this year than we have any other portfolio. But we've got a lot more to do, to your point. I completely agree with you, a lot more to do. So without taking too much time, just let's run through some of the fundamentals, the framework. We've announced we're committed to net zero by 2050. I shouldn't be able to boast about that. That should just be a minimum bipartisan consensus. But anyway, I can boast about it because the government hasn't. We have said that should be legislated. We would legislate it. The government should legislate it. Just some sort of statement is not going to cut the mustard. You've got to have the law. And we've also said the government should increase the 2030 target, the medium-term target at Glasgow. If they don't, then we'll announce our roadmap to net zero by 2050, including, targets along the way and everything that entails. But we want to give them the chance to get it right at Glasgow first. But we'll announce in plenty of time before the election what our roadmap to net zero is. But we've also announced that it is important to say the target's not enough. You need the policies underpinning to achieve it. And that's, Scott Morrison says that, but unfortunately he uses it as an alibi not to do either, not to have the target or the policies. I say you need both. But we started announcing them. We've got community batteries, which is important for that storage challenge we were talking about. We've got the electric vehicle tax cut, which we've already announced. That's part of our electric vehicle offering, but we've got more to say about electric vehicles. We want to make electric vehicles cheaper and give people more choice. We've got our new energy apprentices, because we're going to have a skills shortage. If we get this right as a country, we've got to be training young people. We've got rewiring the nation, which is important for upgrading the grid to get to the renewables to where the energy will be consumed. Very, very important. They're the policies we've announced so far, but I completely agree with you, Kane. We've got a lot more to do, and you'll hear a lot more from us.
Great, Chris. We are out of time. Great to meet the Labrador, and
this is one of them. This is Ollie. The other one's hiding under the table, but he was wobbling the table from time to time. But that's what we've got. Ollie and Toby.
That's life at the moment, isn't it? There in the backyard. Chris, thanks so much for joining us today. Thanks for your great work and engagement. I guess what you've already done, I think, is really welcome to the industry and a big support for the transition. And we look forward to continuing to work with you on months ahead, both in the lead up to the election and subject to the outcome long into the future.
It's very kind of you, Kane, and thanks for your leadership and the leadership of the Clean Energy Council and in winning these arguments. We are in a spot where we can win this and can put to bed the toxic politics the last couple of decades, but we've all got a massive task ahead of us in coming months.
Great. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Kane.
Yeah, Chris Bowen there, he looked pretty relaxed sitting in his backyard, I think, despite the intensity of the climate and energy policy debate that he's obviously deeply immersed in at the moment. So thanks to Chris for joining us. Our next speaker is coming to us in real life, obviously coming virtually across the internet, but coming live to us. Darren Miller is obviously the Chief Executive Officer of ARENA. ARENA has been and continues to play such a crucial role in supporting and driving the transition of the energy sector here in Australia. Obviously, a massive role in supporting emerging renewable technologies and solutions, but I think now more importantly, playing a much more a broader role in helping to drive Australia towards that zero emissions objective in so many ways. Darren has more than 25 years experience across a range of sectors, obviously including renewable energy, electricity retailing, technology, finance, media, and entertainment. I'm fascinated to know what the entertainment bit was. Since joining ARENA as CEO in 2018, he's introduced new investment priorities that include the acceleration of hydrogen to create opportunities across the domestic economy and position Australia to become a major renewable energy exporter. Prior to joining ARENA, Darren was co-founder and CEO of Mojo Power, an innovative electricity retailer. So incredibly well qualified and well positioned to talk to us this morning on the role for demand flexibility in Australia's net zero future. Good morning to you, Darren, and welcome to All Energy 2021.
Well, hi, Kane. Thank you, and thank you for that very nice introduction. Well, I might get started. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us today. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm presenting to you today from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. As Kane said, I'm Darren Miller. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of ARENA, the Australian Renewable Energy Agency. And with ARENA having been established in 2012 with the goal of improving the competitiveness of renewable energy technology and increasing the supply of renewable energy in Australia, we've now invested over $1.8 billion across over 600 projects right throughout Australia. And looking back over the past decade, we can't help but feel impressed and inspired by the improvements that we've seen and the cost reductions of the important technologies like solar, wind and batteries that have been experienced. But as technologies have matured, ARENA has turned its attention increasingly to what's needed for the future. And last year, the agency was refunded with an additional $1.6 billion for the next 10 years. And we recently launched our new investment plan, which sets out our mission and the key technologies that we will be looking to support to achieve our goals. And one of the core investment themes in our new investment plan has to do with demand flexibility. And it's this theme that I'd like to explore today to share with you why it's so important for our journey to net zero. The International Energy Agency, the IEA, has recently stated that solar energy is now the cheapest form of energy in history. And with around 30% of our electricity in the NEM coming from solar, wind and hydro, we're well underway to replacing traditional electricity generation from coal and gas with new, cleaner technology. And with over 2.5 million households having installed rooftop solar PV, we're leading the world in this important technology. So the message is that solar and wind are now unstoppable, but the road to 100% renewable energy comes with challenges, including technical challenges, regulatory challenges, and commercial challenges. And all of this needs to be solved if we're to enjoy a highly reliable and low-cost system, as well as one that is low in emissions. So the one thing we know is that once solar and wind, so-called variable renewables, cross a threshold of around 50% penetration in our grids, up from around 20% today, we're going to need increasing levels of energy storage. And once we pass 80% and try and head towards 100%, the amount of storage required increases exponentially. So we know that storage comes in the form of large-scale batteries and home batteries. It'll also come from pumped hydro facilities like Snowy 2.0, Hydro Tasmania's Battery of the Nation, and the Genex Kidston project in central Queensland, all of which ARENA have supported. ARENA is also exploring and supporting newer forms of storage like thermal storage, compressed air, flow batteries, and hydrogen. Some of these technologies are maturing quickly and others are far from commerciality, but they have one thing in common, and that is that they're all expensive. We know that AEMO has forecast that by 2040, we'll need around 6 to 19 gigawatts of new dispatchable resources to firm up the inherently variable nature of distributed and large-scale renewable generation. At the top end of this range, that's equivalent to the power output of around 10 Snowy 2.0s, and if each one of those costs $5 billion, as Snowy does, that's an awfully expensive way to back up our energy system, and this is a challenge that must be solved if we're to prosper from our new energy system. We can think of the way that demand can respond and participate in layers. Firstly, without affecting our lifestyle, we can choose to use less energy. These opportunities only come by occasionally, such as when we renovate or rebuild our homes. We should then consider good design, thermal insulation, and ventilation. These are things that can permanently reduce our need for manufactured energy. On a more frequent basis, though, we can choose to improve our energy efficiency. For example, when appliances fail, we can replace them with more efficient options. We can also choose to switch from gas space heating and water heating to electric heating. And increasingly, we'll have the option to switch from petrol and diesel vehicles to electric, which are around 3 times more efficient. Next, we can shift when we use electricity to times of day when solar and wind are available and therefore cheap. And if we're unable to change our demand to match supply, then at an additional cost, we can utilize stored energy. This can be at a household level or could be done at a grid level. And finally, if all of the above fails during extreme peak days, such as prolonged summer heat waves, it may be necessary to reduce or entirely eliminate consumption for a period of time with demand response, or for the market operator or network operator to shed load involuntarily. It's step 3 in this hierarchy, shifting usage, which is where demand flexibility fits in and what I'd like to explore in more detail. So demand flexibility is one important solution to the challenge of increasing penetration of renewables. With cheap renewable energy, cost-effective storage and flexible demand, we can have a highly reliable, low emissions and low cost system. Demand flexibility is very simply the idea of having our consumption of electricity respond to supply when it is available. For the past 100 or more years, our energy system has taken demand as a given, and supply has been required to ramp up and down to provide energy at the exact time and place that it's required. The demand flexibility is essentially the inverse, in that supply is a given based on when the sun is shining or the wind is blowing, and demand is made to respond to this. The response can range from set and forget type actions, like making sure that pool pumps are set to turn on during sunlight hours only, to highly intelligent real-time responsive actions like shutting down an industrial process on the rare occasions when the grid is under stress on the hottest afternoons of the year. The laws of physics require that supply and demand are constantly in balance, but there is no law that dictates that demand is immutable and supply must always adapt to serve this demand. So I'd like to go through a few examples of demand flexibility in action to give you a sense of what it could look like. So firstly, we need a new definition of off-peak. And most basic of all, if our future energy system will generally have an excess of energy in the middle of the day, then energy will be cheapest from the hours of, say, 10 a.m. in the morning to 3 p.m. in the afternoon. Traditionally, these daylight hours have been the most expensive times for energy, and we've been incentivized to use power after 10 p.m. and until 7 a.m., so-called off-peak hours. But as the penetration of solar increases in the years ahead, we'll be flipping the definition of off-peak to be during daylight hours. We'll then want to run our dishwashers and washing machines in the day rather than at night. This is not the smartest version of demand flexibility, though, since there will certainly be times when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing. But it is directionally right and a sensible and impactful first step. Next step is we will have smart appliances that are responsive to the energy market. If you have an electric hot water system or are looking to buy one, you can look to make it smart so that your water heats when the sun is out. It can heat directly from your solar PV if you have one, or it can be grid responsive and heat up when energy is cheap, which by definition is when solar and wind are abundant. Smarter versions can respond to wind conditions too, so that your hot water system can be turned on during the night if wind is available. This will be true for pool pumps too, which are large consumers of energy for the 1 million or so homes in Australia that have pools. In the future, smart pool pumps might only turn on when the sun is shining or when the grid is uncongested. Arena has projects with Ream for smart hot water systems and with Pooled Energy for smart pool systems. Both of these companies are working on exactly this opportunity. The third example involves smart charging of electric vehicles. EVs are a huge opportunity for demand flexibility. When you get an electric vehicle, you'll likely want to plug it in when you get home. But your car doesn't need to start charging immediately, and it doesn't need a charge every day. You only need your battery sufficiently charged by the time you want to leave for work in the morning. You shouldn't mind whether your car avoids charging at 8 p.m. when the grid is constrained and only starts when the wind is blowing somewhere, say at 2 a.m. Arena has funded 4 electric vehicle managed charging projects that are all looking to engage with customers on their charging behaviors and utilize a mix of smart hardware and software to measure and modify when charging occurs. Finally, another very large potential opportunity for demand flexibility is one we might miss entirely if we're not careful. Here I'm referring to the production of zero emissions hydrogen via electrolysis, which has been capturing everyone's attention recently. Manufacturing green hydrogen at scale for domestic and export use will require many tens of gigawatts of electrolysis capacity and even greater quantities of new solar and wind capacity to provide the energy input that is needed. Project developers will be faced with the choice of where to locate the electrolysis plants, and one of the key design choices will be whether these plants have their own off-grid dedicated solar and wind installations, or alternatively, whether the electrolyzers will be grid connected with new solar and wind generators located potentially hundreds of kilometers away. It is this latter design choice where the opportunity lies for demand flexibility to dramatically reduce the cost of producing hydrogen and servicing peaks in electricity demand elsewhere in the system. Grid-connected hydrogen electrolyzers can be turned down or off quickly at times when demand is high and supply is low. In general, hydrogen can be produced intermittently, whereas electricity is required in real time. Arena has an extensive portfolio of around 37 hydrogen projects and has committed or approved over $160 million to this important emerging area over the past few years. We're seeing much larger projects now coming through and being planned for the years ahead, and in every case, we're looking at the potential for electrolyzers to operate flexibly, potentially providing grid services and making their electricity input available to the electricity system when required. So what's needed to realize this opportunity? 3 things are required for the potential benefits of demand flexibility to be realized. Firstly, we need the technology to enable devices and loads to be flexible. Sensors and meters that can record what is happening at a device level, real-time communications and data processing, smart software algorithms and machine learning that can make the best decisions for us. Secondly, regulations and policies need to evolve to recognize the opportunity and ensure that the value of demand flexibility can be monetized. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, consumers and businesses need to be aware and embrace the opportunities and factor in smart choices across the electricity hierarchy. Use less, choose more efficient options, shift usage, and finally store energy. Many of you would know of the energy trilemma, the need for energy that is simultaneously reliable, low cost, and low emissions. Solar and wind are low cost and low emissions, but can't be relied on all the time. Coal and gas are reliable, but are high emissions and increasingly costly. When it comes to the supply of energy, there is no perfect solution. Demand flexibility, though, ticks all the boxes. It can help the reliability and security of the system by responding in times of supply shortages or system stress. It can help reduce costs by substituting for more expensive options like storage. And importantly, it has the potential to lower emissions by reducing or eliminating the need for peaking generation from natural gas and accelerating the uptake of solar and wind. Demand flexibility is a 21st century technology for a 21st century grid. The world around us is increasingly digital and customer-centric, and energy has been moving in this direction too. We just heard from Chris Bowen talk about energy storage as being the key to unlocking this opportunity. I hope I've successfully put forward the case for demand flexibility as equally important and an opportunity where consumers have a central role. Thanks very much, everyone.
Darren, thanks very much. Certainly a strong case for demand flexibility and very well presented. Thank you. We've got time just for a couple of questions I wanted to pose before we throw across to Luke and the panel. You spoke about the opportunity for EV in terms of the demand flexibility piece. I'm interested in your assessment as to how we're going with that. You mentioned, I think, 4 programs that ARENA has been supporting in terms of managed charging. What's your early assessment? How close are we to sort of really unlocking and, I guess, optimizing the integration of EVs into the system and the grid?
Well, it's obviously very early, Kane. I mean, we know that EV sales represent something around 0.7% of new car sales in Australia. So by definition, we have very low numbers of EVs hitting our roads, and we have a huge vehicle fleet, so it's going to take time. Even if we were at the 20s and 30% penetration like the UK is looking at, it's going to take a decade before you turn over the vehicle fleet. So we are working with consumers and energy companies, networks and retailers to do that early testing of how people plug in, when they want to charge, what kind of incentives they'll take, what kind of devices they'll allow to be connected, and what kind of control they're prepared to give up. And I think the real danger is that if consumers aren't part of the conversation and aren't aware of the system challenges that can occur as the EV penetration increases, we're going to find that just like solar PV, where everyone thinks it's their right to have as large a system on their roof as possible and get paid for it, people might feel that EVs are their natural right to plug in and have fully charged while they're watching dinner with their air conditioners cranked up. That would be a terrible end result for the system and for consumers ultimately. So we need to get in the habit of being smarter about when we use energy. And EVs is just this giant load that's coming onto the grid. We need to be ready for it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's coming really, really fast. And if you look at even just the size of a battery that people are putting into their home relative to the battery that'll be pulling up into their driveway, it's a massive opportunity and potentially quite daunting as far as the impacts on the grid and the system that we need to sort out. From one end, from people's house driveway to something at the utility scale end, you mentioned electrolyzers and obviously the opportunity for demand flexibility in the context of renewable hydrogen and the electrolyzer technology. What's your assessment? Is the technology about there in terms of having that capability and flexibility? And then I've got a follow-up question picking up on the announcement from Twiggy Forrest last week about plans to essentially manufacture electrolyzer technology in Australia. Does that make sense to you? Science fiction? Will it become reality?
Yeah, let's take those two things. Like, what is it going to take? In terms of the technology's development, can it be responsive to the grid? I don't think it's a technology challenge at all. All the manufacturers of the hydrogen electrolyzers are ready and able to have those devices modulate their energy requirement. They can be modulated down. They can turn off when required. The challenge is regulatory and commercial, right? It's regulatory in that we need a system that values the flexibility and allows for those electrolyzers to be grid connected and for AEMO to see them as a technology that can be utilized to provide that demand service. And the commercial models that we're setting up with the production of hydrogen need to accommodate that as well. We don't want to get into a situation where a producer of green hydrogen has sold all of their supply on a 100% offtake basis to a foreign country, and we effectively have no rights to turn down or modulate the supply and production of that hydrogen. If we can get the regulatory side right and the commercial side right, the technology will be easy. But it's so important we look ahead and don't design our way out of the opportunity. When you run the models, you can see that you can achieve a much lower cost of hydrogen if your electrolyzer is grid responsive. You can achieve a much lower electricity price for electricity consumers, if that new solar and wind is grid connected and not just isolated off the hydrogen. So I think we need to have that policy, regulatory, commercial discussion the technologies will absolutely follow. And as for the idea of manufacturing high-value products in Australia, I mean, who could argue with that? We don't want to be the world's quarry. We want to dig stuff up, produce it, turn it into things that are useful and higher value. And I think the opportunity to manufacture the equipment that manufactures the energy is absolutely an interesting idea that we should chase.
You'd have to be pretty brave to bet against Twiggy on that one, wouldn't you? Hey, Darren, thanks very much. I know you're going to join our panel to contribute to further conversation shortly. So we'll see you on the panel. I'm now going to hand the chairing baton over to my colleague and good friend Luke Menzel. Luke is the CEO of the Energy Efficiency Council. I know he'd be very excited by Darren's presentation or the discussion about demand flexibility. Luke is one of Australia's leading advocates for the role of energy efficiency, energy management and demand response in Australia's energy transition. He's also Vice President of the Australian Sustainable Built Environment Council, sits on the Neighbours National Steering Committee, etc., etc. And above and on top of all of that, he's now a world-famous podcaster. If you haven't seen and heard his podcast, check it out. He's got shares some wonderful insights, and he's got such a wonderful voice for it. So, Luke, over to you for a fantastic panel discussion, and thanks for joining us.
Hey, thank you, Kane. And might I say that there's room for more than one CEO on a clean energy podcast. So, given the quality of the interviews that you just knocked out with Minister D'Ambrosio and Chris Bowen, I want to know when you're going to be joining the fray.
I'll leave it to you, Luke. All yours.
All right. Well, I might say welcome to everybody. It is my pleasure to be bringing this one home. We're about halfway through. We've got another hour with you today. My name is Luke Menzel. I'm CEO of the Energy Efficiency Council, the peak body for Australia's energy efficiency, energy management and demand response sector. And given that demand response dot point in the things that we cover, I am indeed delighted by Darren's presentation. It really underlines the way that demand response, demand flexibility brings the two pieces of the clean energy transition together, the renewables piece, which we've heard a lot about in the first half of this session, and then of course the energy efficiency piece that we're so passionate about here at the Energy Efficiency Council. But the topic for today's session is the pathway to net zero, which is sort of the superset of issues that we're dealing with in the decarbonisation of the energy space. I thought you might be interested to hear a little bit about how we choose the topics for these joint plenaries. So this is the third joint plenary that REED and the EEC and the Clean Energy Council pulled together. And it's pretty straightforward. We are guided by you. We put out a survey, REED puts out a survey to gauge what you want us to talk about. And in 2021, when that survey went out, the response was resounding. You wanted us to dig into this topic of net zero. And I wanted to say congratulations to all of you, because you've clearly got your finger on the pulse, because what else could we be talking about in this week of all weeks, 12 days out of the COP that's taking place in Glasgow, and indeed in a week in which our national government is straining every sinew to land that net zero commitment. So we've got an outstanding panel that will be diving into all of those issues that are so current this week. But while I'll be asking some questions, we're very keen to hear from you as well. There is a Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. I'm going to be chatting with our guests for the next half hour, but the balance of the time together will be driven by you and your questions. I can't promise I'll get to everyone. There's a lot of people on this call today, but I'll try and get to a representative sample and get our panellists to weigh in on as many of those questions as possible. So I'm going to introduce all our panellists up front, and then I'll go through and have a little chat with each of them as we work our way through. So first up, I'm delighted to say we have my friend John Connor, who's CEO of the Carbon Market Institute, which is of course an independent industry association for businesses that are leading on the transition to net zero emissions. Hello, John. Next up, we have Zoe Whitten, who is Executive Director of Pollination, a specialist climate change investment and advisory firm. Hello, Zoe. We also have Greta Stevens, Chief Executive of climate change for BlueScope, which is an organisation, as we know, that has been a mainstay of the steel industry here in Australia for over a century. Hello, Greta. And last but certainly not least, we have Anna Melos, Country Lead for Australia at Climeworks Australia, who really spearheads the research for how we do that transition to a net zero economy, but increasingly is driving the action that's going to get us there. Welcome, Anna. And as Kane mentioned on the way through, we are delighted to have Darren join us for this panel discussion as well. John, I have to start with you. There's obviously, intrigue, debate, discussion roiling the halls of our nation's parliament as we speak. I haven't checked the feeds in the last hour, but last time I did, it looked very likely we were going to get a net zero by 2050 commitment. It looked less likely we were going to get an increase or a formal increase to our 2030 target. I'm sort of interested in your reflections on what's happening in Canberra at the moment, but perhaps more importantly, does what appears to be on the table at the minute, would that represent Australia pulling its weight when we roll into Glasgow if we're interested in meeting our ambitions under the Paris Climate Agreement, which is, of course, keeping global warming at or under 1.5 degrees?
Yeah, well, thank you, Luke, and thank you, everyone, for inviting me to this session and participating online. I can do a quick shameless plug, if I may. I'm really hoping that our summit on 9th and 10th of December in Sydney will be in person, and we'll be able to see you all in person. So fingers crossed on that. Look, your timing, though, is impeccable. I mean, ours will be interesting because we'll be unpicking what happens here and at COP 26, and it is really important. Obviously, this has got to be a global effort. And what a country like Australia, with its high carbon political economy, its exports, and let alone its own infrastructure does, is really important. People do forget we're one of the biggest emitters in the top 20. We have very high per capita, but also we have a very effective global diplomatic corps and engagement internationally now, and looking excitingly into more renewable exports as well. So how we handle ourselves is important, and we have been a great force for good as well as force for obstruction in those talks. So it was actually with great enthusiasm we've started to see the movement over the last month or so. I'm really delighted to see the Business Council of Australia join others such as Carbon Market Institute in advocating that we've actually got a policy architecture here in Australia that can be a springboard for ambition. We do have a good system of measuring and verifying our Australian carbon credit units. It's looking to do things like the guarantee of origin and for hydrogen and elements that Darren's speaking around. We do have some integrity in all of that. We actually have carbon pricing and carbon pricing mechanisms here in Australia with the safeguard mechanism, which is a limit on pollution, but one which is currently static, but it's certainly one which is facing carbon prices in the spot market now well above the fixed price that the Gillard pricing mechanism had. So that and the call for actually around 46 to 50% ambition from the BCA was very welcome. And we saw reports that Angus Taylor's due to come up with, Minister Taylor's to come up with some projections which have us 35% reduced by of 2005 levels by 2030. So the hopes were higher that we'd get some ambition there. The net zero by 2050 is definitely good, but it's an entry ticket only into those negotiations and to the effort to avoid to keep warming well below 2 degrees and to pursue 1.5 degrees. So we do want to see some greater ambition, and the pressure will be up. I expect out of COP26 we'll see an annual process, not just the 5-yearly process that the Paris Agreement has, to be keeping the pressure on. So that policies in behind that are really going to be important, and that's what has credibility and heft in the international negotiations.
John, were you surprised that that proposal from BCA to use that existing policy architecture of the safeguard mechanism, which was put in place by Greg Hunt back in the day as sort of one of the suite of policies that kind of put some guardrails around the whole direct action initiative. So this is this is a coalition mechanism. Were you surprised to see that it was sort of discounted by the government as a potential lever right out of the gate?
Disappointed, perhaps not entirely surprised, but and I think there are many still wanting to have one last go at the climate culture wars in the coalition, and we're seeing that playing out right now. I mean, I think people feel reluctant to let the cudgel go, but what I'm disappointed about is that what we have there in that safeguard mechanism, and I think it was in Minister Hunt's long game, many of us who've been around here for a while have heard him talk of that, that this would actually, we could have those baselines coming down. And it's a dirty secret amongst industry. They know that this is perhaps the best bet rather than pulling back to, while it's suboptimal, there are many suboptimals and worse that are out there in terms of sending an investment signal. And that's what I was delighted the most about, is actually this debate now being reframed around those sorts of mechanisms as an investment signal to get the technology that we need and to get that in place. Because at the moment, we just did a survey of business, and policy and regulatory uncertainty is the biggest barrier to decarbonisation investment. And so we need some of that. Yes, we're seeing some great initiatives from companies like Orica, BlueScope, Twiggy and Fortescue and others. They're doing this. Business is certainly wanting to get ahead with that, but they're also being hampered in their strategic decision making by the lack of a longer signal. And so disappointed that the government took that position, not entirely surprised, but delighted that we've got strong voices now across business and the community calling for this safeguard mechanism to be a springboard for our ambition.
Well, the view out in the policy in the public domain certainly seems to be coalescing. It's probably a perfect segue to you, Zoe, because there has been a remarkable shift in the views of Australia's business community over the last couple of years, driven in no small part by the views of investors, the views of capital. Among the many hats you wear is you're a board member of the investor group on climate change, and just 2 or 3 months ago there was the latest edition of your investor survey gauging their views on companies that are committing to net zero. You watch this space much more closely than I do, Zoe, but my strong sense is that investor interest and importantly following through in terms of actions and decisions based on concern around carbon risk is accelerating at a rate of knots. Is that fair?
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's obviously the case, and all of those in this group and many on the call as well will know that investors have been working on this for a hot minute. So, we spent the last 5 years going through TCFD, more recently Climate Action 100 plus. The companies in the audience know that the engagement process has been pretty relentless on climate change for a while now. And certainly those of us who are on the investor side in the sector, we sort of tend to call each other about in May each year and complain about how much busier it is this year than last year. And I can tell you that this year was no different, despite the fact that last year we thought it couldn't get bigger. But I mean, to your point, what I would say is that it has all started running faster this year, and there are probably a few clear ways that we can really see a difference there. And probably the first is that it's really become normal. So we've been talking about, some of us have been talking about climate change and investment for a long time, but we really used to speak to very specialist teams within the investor universe. You turn up and there'd be the RI team or the ESG team, and those would be the people who'd be really interested in this. Now, certainly in the last 18 months, you speak to everyone. Everyone wants to talk about it. Everyone's interested in it. Everyone's having to think about it. I'd say the second thing that's probably quite different is that over, probably the last 2 years, investors have really got in their groove on the topic. And so a lot of best practice has been developed. The Climate Action 100 plus engagement system is an example of that. But it means that previously, a few years ago, the conversations were always about what is best practice going to be, and what are we going to ask for, and what is enough, and how are we going to do it. But now a lot of those conversations have sort of been sorted, not all of them, but the emphasis has really moved to execution. And so the rubber's really hitting the road on some of those decisions that have been talked about for a lot of time, like divestment or, pushing for transformational change in companies. But it's actually happening now. We've sort of all figured out that we're on the same page, and now it's about implementation. But the third thing I think I'd say is that probably the most striking things about what investors are doing on this topic this year is that it has finally got real, so to speak. And what I mean by that is that, 5 years ago, a lot of people were talking about this, but it was a lot about very narrow ideas of, there might be some specific stranded assets, or we've got a particular set of risks we want to deal with. And realistically, if you're looking at a transition that's going to affect your entire economy, then you're not just going to be thinking about this in investment contexts in this really narrow scope of activity. And what we're seeing now is that the entire market has kind of grokked the opportunity. We've had that experience with renewables where they're now, for investors, a lot of the time in the it's too expensive and I wished we'd got there earlier bucket. But investors, having had that experience, are really understanding that there's a transition underway across the whole system. And the shift, what that's meant is this big shift to opportunity. So we're seeing this rush of activity in asset classes that weren't previously really paying as much attention to this, particularly private markets. And investors are really, really shopping for transition opportunity. So there's been that really big shift to sort of say, yes, we're doing a lot more, but what we're seeing now looks like the market is actually starting to price transition, not properly, not completely, but actually starting to price transition in risk and opportunity across the whole system.
So there's been a range of views expressed in the national public debate on this sort of massive shift and acceleration of interest. Obviously, we had our nation's Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, make a really important intervention within the last month that was pointing to this reality, and one that the government and the nation needed to accept and accommodate. You've had others who have said, well, it's inappropriate for investors, it's inappropriate for banks or superannuation funds to be kind of driving the nation's policy agenda and economic direction. What's your reaction to that?
Well, it's a great question, and as you note, it's had significant ventilation in the last 12 months. I think when you ask the investment community about this, the first thing most of them will say to you is it is my job to manage risk. So you can't hand me a responsibility, which is to say, do the best job you can as a steward of this capital, which in a lot of cases in Australia is public. It's a sort of public good capital. We're talking about superannuation. Don't hand me a task that is to say, do a fantastic job of managing this, take care of it, pursue all the right opportunities, be really sophisticated, satisfy your fiduciary duty, and then at the same time say, but this whole category of risk over here, which is super significant for your investment portfolio, you're not allowed to manage that. So that's the response you'll get from a lot of Australian investors. This is a really big part of the thinking that we have to do to run this money properly. And it was interesting, actually. I was speaking to an asset owner in North America this morning, and we were sort of kicking around what this means for asset allocation for regions. And one of the things that they sort of said, just as a side point, was, some economies, and in this case we're talking about Canada, are very exposed to transition in the way that Australia is. Lots of big energy industries, all the same thing. And they were saying, well, if they don't do anything about it, then potentially we need to start thinking about, do we allocate away from those markets? Because we can't have everything sitting in this basket in a place where there's not enough policy, there's a lot of transition risk exposure, there's a lot of physical exposure, and just as investors who have a duty to take care of that capital go, yeah, we're fine, we'll leave it there. So that's really been the conversation. There are lots of layers to this conversation, which are about norms and responsibility and all that other stuff. But when it comes down to it, particularly for Australian investors who've got very strong fiduciary duty constraints, the emphasis really is on how do we make the right decisions, and how do we do it in a way that doesn't mean that we had to stay out of it for political reasons, and then the rest of the capital system got to invest in the thing and moved in the right direction, and we basically end up cross-funding someone else's opportunity.
Yeah. Can I summarise that perhaps rather crudely by saying that, concern around carbon risk for investors isn't some woke frolic. It is actually core business. It's core to what investors do, and day in and day out, and this is effectively a new category of risk that they're now managing. All right, well, we've discussed this at a very high level. Let's get down to some granular detail with you, Greta, a big business, a big industrial business in BlueScope, and a significant intervention that your organisation made just a couple of months ago with the announcement of the goal that you will be targeting net zero emissions. I'm wondering, if you can ground the conversation a little for us, what drove that decision, firstly, and also how you see the task that is before BlueScope, and indeed the task that's before the broader industrial sector as we target this goal collectively. I can't hear you, Greta. I'm not sure if anyone else is having an issue.
Someone had to do it, and it was.
There you go.
You.
I think you've run your on mute bingo, Greta. Well done.
Good to be here today. So back to your question, action on climate change is one of the things that matters most to our stakeholders, picking up Zoe's point, and it's integrated into our corporate strategy, our capital allocation framework. We've actually always worked on reducing our carbon emissions because the inputs to iron and steel making, such as coal, which is a reductant in our process, not a fuel source, but also gas and electricity, they're expensive, right? So using less has always been good business. But over time, obviously, that economic imperative has been overlaid with carbon action. So we strongly believe that reducing our emissions is the right thing to do, and it's completely aligned with our BlueScope purpose, which is to strengthen our communities for the future. So as you've referenced, in mid-August, we announced our goal of net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, as well as two medium-term 2030 targets. In absolute terms, from 2005, those targets represent emissions reductions of 35% across our global operations, but over 45% in Australia. But yeah, steel, as you said, getting down to the nitty-gritty, there's no future that doesn't use steel. It's used in every aspect of our lives. It's the world's most important engineering and construction material, but it's also infinitely recyclable. So once you invest the resources in that first production, you have it forever. It's also going to underpin our transition to renewable energy. We're using it to build the wind towers, the solar farms, the rooftop solar, and that transmission infrastructure. So what we actually need to do is address a technology gap that exists between our current high emissions processes and those future low to zero emissions processes. So looking forward to that future, current forecasts predict that hydrogen-based iron making will play a very important role, along with increasing proportions of secondary steel making using electric arc furnaces, EAFs, and they recycle the scrap steel. And they can both be based on 100% renewable energy. But what's important is to be aware that right now, the technology and the economics of hydrogen are not there. So even if the hydrogen-based iron making technology was ready today, the cost of input hydrogen at the moment is not even close to where it needs to be. So we are looking some time into the future. In terms of that secondary steel making from scrap, 30% of the world's steel is produced that way, and we do that in our US operations. But for that EAF steel making to be a viable replacement for primary steel making in Australia at the moment, we just don't have the right quantity or the right grades of scrap, and we don't have the competitively priced renewable energy that we would need. So what do we need? And I think all the previous speakers have already talked to it. We need a significant increase in our firmed, affordable renewable energy. And firming in our business is crucial. We can't do that demand interruption. We've got 24/7 continuous processes. So that electricity storage and grid interconnection that's already been discussed is absolutely essential. And secondly, as already discussed, the build out of the hydrogen industry in Australia, which will need to produce at less than that current aspirational target of $2 a kilo. Also needing to be produced close to the point of use, given the additional costs in storage and transport. So as an example, when I say we need a significant increase in renewable energy, if we swapped Port Kembla to this hydrogen-based iron making, that would increase our electricity requirements 15 times, up to 1.4 gigawatts. So we're talking a lot of electricity. All of this requires what's been discussed, that significant investment and the supportive policy environment to deliver this massive increase in the generation, storage, transmission to power new and existing assets and the hydrogen electrolyzers and that network. So we think that large industries such as BlueScope can play a role in driving the transition. In relation to renewables, our offtakes can underpin investments. So as an example, we entered into a PPA with the Finley Solar Farm in New South Wales, taking 2/3 of their generation. And we've announced a renewable manufacturing zone in conjunction with the New South Wales Government in the Illawarra region. In terms of emerging technologies, we're excited by that and ambitious. We've announced that we're investigating a pilot hydrogen electrolyser at our Port Kembla site, and we're entering into technology partnerships to support the development of other emissions reductions technologies as they apply to our industry. So thanks, Luke, for the opportunity to provide context, and I look forward to your questions.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure. We'll no doubt unpack it more in the panel discussion, but when you think about all the different pieces of the puzzle that need to come together for you as an organisation to be able to make that transition, to embrace the opportunity that hydrogen offers to decarbonise your operations. We've had significant announcements from New South Wales. There's action from the federal government. Obviously, Darren is working his tail off over at ARENA to make this all happen. You've got the ETI work that no doubt Anna will be speaking to in a moment. There's a lot of effort in this space. Do you think there's enough effort, or are we still just starting to prime the pump, just starting to get movement? How much more would need to take place over the next number of years to be in a position in the 2030s, for example, to realise some of these aspirations?
I think prime the pump is probably a good observation at this stage. I think it's really starting to get rolling. It's really heartening to see, ongoing announcements such as the recent one from the New South Wales Government around the incentives for build out of hydrogen. Yeah, look, it is just going. I'm an engineer at heart. Engineering projects do take a while to wind up. Can we move a bit faster in terms of some of the generation? I think getting the policy settings right to really incentivise it is probably the most, the thing that we can stimulate the rate with more. I think the technology development is moving apace. I think there's enough economic imperative there.
Yeah, okay, good. Well, I will go to you now, Anna. I treat Climeworks Australia's Decarbonisation Futures Report, released back in 2020 as a bit of a roadmap for all the different pieces of the puzzle that need to come together for us to get this done. It is kind of getting into the granular detail of what you need to do sector by sector rather than just staying at the high level. High level is important. We need to know what the ambition is, but then you need to work through the barriers and opportunities in each part of the economy. So this is a bit of an open question for you, noting everything that we've just heard. Where are the areas where we're doing well, or there's a reasonable amount of momentum, and where, as a nation, do we need to lean in and do more?
Hi there, Luke. From here on Boomerang Land in Melbourne. Great to be able to talk about our work with SARO, because it really does show the big opportunities for Australia, because it's the other side of the story of the challenges and costs of taking action. So at the big picture, we find Australia can get to net zero not just by 2050, but by 2035, which puts us on that 1.5 degree pathway. And by 2030, we find that Australia can reduce emissions by 50 to 75% if we really go all in, get that ambition going. Now, we do need to do more at every sector. There's good momentum in places, but definitely need to do a lot more. And I'll summarise some of our findings, and hopefully we'll be able to unpick some of them. And all of this is about known and emerging technologies. So no news to anyone. Energy is where most of our emissions come from, around about 3/4 of our emissions. And here we've heard about Australia's wealth of renewable energy resources. So it's about using what we've got. Plenty more to do. So in the electricity sector, about 1/3 of our emissions, and key to the broader transformation of the economy. Greta was talking about, how much, if we electrify, how much the demand is. So, very roughly, we can get to renewables to the level of 70-90% by 2030. The 90% comes from very recent work we did for Transgrid. And it's interesting that each time we update these scenarios, we find that the electricity sector can move further faster because of the change, the cost changes we all know about, not just about generation, but storage and managing reliability, demand management, those aspects. And, deep changes across the economy do rely on that scaling up that's been mentioned. So, near zero for existing demand, you're talking about, a decade. That capacity to meet at least doubling demand to allow for electrification in buildings and transport, that's about kind of twice what we've got now. And then the other aspects that Greta was talking about, really unlocking our power as a superpower in clean energy resources, that is, 300%, 500%. It's all about how much we export to the world. We can stay an energy exporter to the world, but it would be in these new fuels, and that needs a big scaling up. And obviously, if you scale up, you also need to sort out transmission. Now, sort of touching on industry, you mentioned the ETI, which is the Australian Industry Energy Transition Initiative, bit of a mouthful. That's working with participants like BlueScope, that are really in these heavy industry supply chains like iron and steel, to look at the challenges. So I don't want to underestimate the challenges, but we also see the opportunities. We research those solutions. There is complexity, but some of them can be done now. We've talked about getting energy efficiency and material efficiencies, as highlighted by Darren, sourcing renewables. 15% roughly currently of Australia's emissions come from the electricity use in industry. If you switch those through PPAs and other things through energy efficiency, you get a big reduction. And there's a lot of momentum in these two areas. Then the shift to other zero emission fuels, bit trickier. The technologies may be known, but not all are readily available here, and not all are at that kind of proper commercial scale. They're still being piloted. And then there is the non-energy emission side that, Greta was discussing. Now, opportunities and the changes here in industry are just extraordinary. We've all been hearing these recent announcements coming out from governments, from businesses, and it's about that export to green hydrogen and ammonia, and about changing our existing industry to being kind of producing green steel, green aluminium, and getting that premium. We're getting the major investments, but it will take time. Momentum's building. We've got to still get there. Now, transport, less momentum here in many ways, at least in Australia. It's still about a fifth of our emissions, and it's growing. There are some kind of important wins, I'd say easy, but somehow they haven't quite been. So, some of that is getting people out of cars for short journeys. But it's also switching light vehicles to electrics. Now, apparently Australia is once again considering vehicle emission standards, which are the obvious solution here. Across the world, you've now got the major companies saying they're going to switch by 2030, 2035. There's clear momentum elsewhere. We need to make sure we stay with that momentum and don't become a dumping ground. Even in heavy vehicles, technology changes are happening fast. So it's about getting the infrastructure in place to make the most about it, and getting, fleet buyers to understand what the possibilities are. And then quickly, agriculture, still 10%, a lot of challenges here, but good opportunities to reduce methane and get, better fertilizer use, things like that. And also, of course, net zero doesn't mean zero emissions. Now, Australia does have excellent opportunities for carbon storage in the land, in our marine systems, in soil carbon, and, these kind of nature-based solutions. And we do see some role for carbon capture and storage, but pretty limited because of the technical challenges, the geographical limitations, and the costs. Now, finally, I'll end on buildings, because they're currently responsible for about a fifth of Australia's emissions. People have touched on electricity and gas use, and known solutions can have considerable benefits. High performance buildings save us money, improve our health and comfort. They deal better with heat and cold. Research is showing the negative health impacts of things like indoor gas use through asthma. So there's a lot of good reasons to switch, not just about our emissions. And we know how to build better buildings. We know the policies that can drive change. And next year, hopefully, a new edition of the National Construction Code will come into place with increases in energy performance for domestic buildings. But that's not locked in yet. It should be. And also, changing existing buildings is harder, especially for rentals like I live in. And, we have a lot of low performance buildings. And just think of all the jobs that could come from, changing houses like mine. So in summary, big challenges, but even bigger opportunities to change. And we do see it in the granularity of our work. And, Australia is not yet where it needs to be, but we're really getting there. There is momentum in each sector. It is patchy and we can do more. So
one of the things that strikes me about that, Anna, is, this thing that governments, and I guess all of us that are sort of engaged in this debate need to do, which is kind of simultaneously grappling with these big long-term shifts that need to happen in the industry, for example, and require innovation and significant investments, transformations of supply chains. That's one task, and we need to get cracking on that. But simultaneously, you just mentioned buildings. You've got, currently available technologies, a different set of issues in terms of how you scale that up from a policy-making perspective and sort of fix every building in the country, if I can put it in that crude way. You've kind of got to do that simultaneously and crack on with that. And by doing that, we create space and give time to some of those industries that are harder to decarbonise to work through that journey. How on earth do we keep all this in our head at the same time and drive this momentum simultaneously?
Well, I think one thing is by having good climate change frameworks. So, some of our states have got a Climate Change Act. There's one proposed federally. We did used to have an overarching one. And the advantage of having that overarching is it can set out tasks, so it can go, right, we need to think about this, at a certain level every 5 years in line with the Paris Agreement. We need to think about it sector by sector so that you have plans, you have roadmaps, you have discussions going on about, what the task looks like and what good looks like. So there's that kind of, setting something overarching. I think it's really looking at the barriers, remembering that, I think we did get a bit carried away kind of 10 years ago as the carbon price being the answer to everything. Some things, a carbon price is really important. It drives investment. It sets a clear signal. I would never underestimate it. Far too much of a policy wonk for that. But, there are other barriers. It's not price directly that is why I sit in a cold house. So what's the barriers in each system? What are the things we really need to overcome, and how do we unlock those? And how do we make sure that it is kind of businesses and households, and workers that can understand the opportunities, but it is about governments looking at those barriers, working with those different sectors and setting the right frameworks.
Here. Well, Darren, I'll throw to you at this point. You've delivered an absolutely cracking presentation, which, as I said earlier, sort of weaves together the supply side story and the demand side story in terms of how we can make that transition, particularly when we get to a grid which is high penetration renewables, so that demand flexibility becoming incredibly important. But going to Anna's point around the granularity of how that plays out in particular sectors, you've got demand response mechanism launching this month, which is available to a subset of large companies. It isn't currently available to smaller companies or to households. You mentioned the importance of evolution in energy market rules and regulations to enable that. But it's a big task before us, right? To kind of create those incentives in all the different parts of the economy. How are you thinking about that at Arena?
Yeah, I think the way we think about the future is that it's an all of the above, option. We can't afford to back ourselves into a corner with any one particular technology. The scale of the challenge and the importance of getting it right are such that we have to have all hands on deck, and all technologies that are available to potentially help solve that problem need to be given an opportunity. And that's a key sort of lens that Arena takes to things. We're, for example, in the storage space, not just backing it all on lithium ion, or pumped hydro or solar thermal. It's all of that plus everything else that might come to the fore, plus not needing storage at all, and hoping to have a flexible demand system and an overbuild of renewables. All of these things are potential solutions. So, I think that the answer is to put this whole target of net zero behind us all as a country, and then look towards the future with optimism and opportunity, because the opportunities from this transition are just incredible. And I think we're holding ourselves back. We need to push forward and actually build that system that is 3-4 times bigger. As Anna was saying, I think I've talked about 700%. I've heard others talk about 20 times bigger. But anything is possible. If we crack the formula, and the formula is how do we build what we've got at scale? Solar and wind can be done now. We should be pushing as fast as possible. We should be continuing to reduce the costs there, and Arena's got a clear focus on that as well. But beyond that big scale stuff, it's the small scale stuff, the decisions you make as consumers, the devices you buy, the behaviours you have. It's an all of the above scenario, Luke, to solving this problem.
Here. Well, look, I might bring all our panel together for the balance of our time together, and we do have about 20 minutes. I'm scanning through the questions here, and I'm not going to do them all justice, but I'll try and get to a few of them. There's a few questions here on the topic of hydrogen and how we scale up that hydrogen industry. Obviously, Greta, you need the cost of hydrogen delivered to your facilities to come down significantly, but for that we've got to create some demand. There's a question in here not just about how we drive demand, but also how we grapple with the living in one of the driest continents on the planet, and the availability of H2O actually, that being a key variable in this. I'm not sure, Darren, do you want to kick us off by talking about how we actually drive demand that is going to drive that cost down? We've obviously got a lot of pilot projects around the country, sort of getting our head around the technology. What's the next step in terms of doing what we've seen in solar and what we're starting to see in batteries? It's deployment that is going to drive costs down in the hydrogen space, right?
Yeah. So I think in the hydrogen space we're probably where we were in the solar space about 10 years ago. We haven't built our first flagships type projects yet in hydrogen. Arena's got 3 10-megawatt electrolyzers going, but we're seeing opportunities for that to be scaled up by 10, 20 times already, and people looking to build that kind of scale. So I think we just need to get on the journey. In terms of the where do you use it, there's plenty of use cases in Australia, and that's why Arena has said we need to be able to build our domestic capabilities and use hydrogen locally before we get an export opportunity. So things like gas injection to gas pipelines, use in ammonia and ammonium nitrate facilities, which we've got a few of those running around Queensland and WA, and then looking at those first heavy duty transport applications. So we've got a number of things on our table, on our desk, around large trucks and equipment that could use hydrogen. So building variety of demand use cases, then scaling the supply. And I think the good news is I don't think we're that far away, to be honest. I mean, I know that a decade sounds like a long time, but we've got this 30-year, potentially a 30-year net zero vision. If in 10 years' time hydrogen is economic, then it's just going to do what solar is doing now, but it'll be doing that in 10 years' time. And we've seen what's possible with an 89% cost reduction in solar modules over 10 years. And hydrogen electrolyzers are just another manufactured technology. If we get the manufacturing right, and Twiggy is having a crack at that in Australia, we can see electrolyzers come down, and we'll get experience with installing them. We should not be afraid of the fact that the technology is 3 times too expensive today. We just need to get on that journey and scale it and bring it down. We can do it.
Greta, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I agree. This is a chicken and the egg problem, and we can't build out an industry with no offtakes and vice versa. So I think that's where industries such as mine need to play a role. Where a 10 megawatt pilot electrolyzer is not going to do very much other than teach us how to use hydrogen in our process, but it provides an offtake and it provides competency, and it lets us go to the next level. So the challenge, I think, with cost is we do have to have it at the right point before we're going to get large scale uptake. But I think that's where those different use cases that Darren talked about comes into play, because for cost equivalence, heavy transport's likely to go first, maybe then gas replacement goes second, and then maybe you get into using it in steel making, iron making. So it's just about, you know, substituting through the use cases as you come down the cost curve.
So in the questions here, we have some discussion. I'm not sure if I'd go so far to say contention, but there's certainly some folk in here that would argue that electrifying everything should be our mantra, and we've obviously got, you know, some different pathways available to us in different sectors of the economy. You know, you've got electrification, hydrogen, which I, you know, speaking to some friends in the European Commission recently, they described, well, hydrogen is, you know, another way of electrifying everything. I thought that was a nice framing, but it's about, you know, how you frame up this conversation to some degree. And I know that ClimateWorks has put some thought into, you know, the most plausible pathways in different parts of the economy. What would you say to our interlocutor who was saying, well, you know, let's just electrify everything and get on with it? You know, where does that make sense? In which parts of the economy should we be thinking about that?
Yeah. Well, it makes sense in quite a few, and in others it makes sense for a chunk of them. So, you know, buildings, it is pretty much electrify everything. You know, slight question about the pace of change, but there is no reason not to have everything electrified. It's often more efficient, cheaper, better for us. Transport, especially if you think about hydrogen as a version of, you know, an electric vehicle, which particularly in transport it is, then it's definitely about electrifying the vast majority, certainly light vehicles, and even a good chunk of heavy vehicles, either directly electrical or hydrogen fueled. And then in industry, it's more complex. It will be that mix of electrifying, energy efficiency, you know, those two, but also changing processes. And then, you know, how do we use hydrogen? How do we think about the other kind of non-energy, emissions, chemical emissions? What are the best processes there? Some of that will be electrification, some of it will be completely different processes. But yeah, you add hydrogen to the mix and pretty much it's electrify everything.
It's interesting, in Minister D'Ambrosio's comments when, you know, the topic of the gas substitution roadmap came up in her chat with Kane. You know, Victoria is really sticking its chin out on this topic of how you deal with, you know, the parts of particularly heating load in the Victorian context that rely on gas. She name-checked electrification, hydrogen and energy efficiency as kind of the three things that are being brought to bear, and it's going to be fascinating to see, you know, where the Victorian government's land in the relative mix of those elements in that final strategy. Does anyone have anything to add on the whole topic of you know, what fuels we lean into in different parts of the economy?
I'd just chip in a little bit in that, you know, blending does create some useful early markets for hydrogen. So part of the tricky space is great in the early years, but what is the real future, particularly when, you know, we've got, or at least, you know, in Victoria, we have an enormous gas grid. You know, it's a bit like some of the electricity conversations. You know, what's the death spiral or potential death spiral around that gas grid? And yet, how do we, you know, potentially keep the grid to do the delivery of hydrogen where we need it? So, yeah, tricky space.
Luke,
yeah.
I would just add to that. I wanted to riff off the point that Anna made there. I mean, one of the things that I think is a really critical question, and I have to say I'm sort of posing this as a question but not an answer in all of this, is certainly from the investor side, when do you and how do you drop the capex to get across a few of those big hurdles along the way? So Anna, what you were just saying about the gas grid is a great example, because you can imagine in the future if that grid was functioning as a hydrogen transport system, and you've got your electrolyzers are going to come down the curve. They're going to have a very similar technology curve to a lot of the other modular distributed energy options that we've seen recently. You can very easily imagine a future where that whole system works. But between here and there, there's a point where you actually have to dedicate quite a lot of capex to get to sort of do the switch, so to speak. And sometimes, particularly in the case of the gas grids, the transition it's sort of something you almost need to do not all at once, but close to all at once, rather than just being able to go linear here to there. So that's just something I wanted to pull out of what Anna said there, which is, I think, certainly on the minds of a lot of investors. And at the moment, there are a lot of conversations where everyone's saying, well, yes, I can see that's going to be part of the mix. I can see that those trajectories are going to move in a certain way. But what I can't figure out is when to pull the trigger. And certainly, to the point that Greg was making earlier, these engineering projects take a while to get up, and some of them are also very expensive. And so that's a sort of a very active conversation in capital markets is, how quickly do you move on these things to make them happen, and who is the one who dedicates the at-risk capital to get over some of those boundaries along the way?
There's some big calls to make in the next 5, 10, 15 years. And ultimately, and this is kind of why I'm interested in this granularity of different pathways, because you kind of go, well, this makes sense in the context of a particular sector, but the built environment doesn't exist in a vacuum. Industry doesn't exist in the vacuum. All of these systems are interconnected, right? And so ultimately, there's going to be some calls that are going to need to be made by state and federal governments about some of the pathways that we follow in this space, which kind of it goes to that broader topic, John, about having the policy framework which Anna talked to, so that if we can at least agree what the goal is, you can get into some of that granular detail about how we chart that course forward. John, you're obviously very active at the federal level. Have you been sort of heartened by the increasing sophistication at the state level in terms of this transition conversation? Certainly, particularly New South Wales and Victoria, I think, starting to get a fair way along the pathway in terms of grappling with some of the hard questions that they're going to face as state governments. Perhaps federal government getting to the party a little bit later than we'd like, but it's not like there's been nothing happening over the last 5 years or so.
Indeed. No, indeed, and I think Anna's dead right. It's we're seeing those actions. We're going to need those sectoral approaches. We did have the bit of the back-burning or even front-burning approach from the Wilkins review before the CPRS in expectation that was going to come. That was a bit of a mistake, wasn't it? We lost some old friends like the Energy Efficiency Opportunities Act and things like that. And I think we're seeing a much more sophisticated approach, realising we need that coordinated. I think. But it's really important, and it's just this fabulous conversation. But I think that's why things such as the safeguard mechanism, or something which provides that investment guide and a price, is actually a broader impulse and to make those investments. But we really do need this sophistication, sector by sector, to do that. And I think we have made significant leaps and bounds in that. The works of Climate Works, the works of companies that are actually thinking this stuff through, and the states are actually really are pushing forward on this. But for me, we still need to come back to with the urgent time frame that we have to get this going. We still need that coordinating framework and impulse and investment signals. So let's get it all together.
I think it's pretty clear that climate is again going to be very high up the agenda in the upcoming election. We've talked a little bit about, the cavalcade of net zero commitments from businesses around the country. I sort of want to pose this as a topic to the group. BlueScope, incredible amount of sophistication within that organisation. We've been on the journey, talking to, your team, Greta, within BlueScope for many years now, huge investments in energy efficiency over the journey, a really granular understanding of what's going on in terms of your business. My sense is that there are businesses out there that are making net zero commitments that are not as far along that journey and are perhaps a kind of making the commitment, because they see that it's the right thing to do, but then are in the process of working through, well, what exactly does that mean, and how are we going to achieve this? How do we support business on that journey, noting that we need the policy frameworks and we need to keep pushing for that at the national level, but given this groundswell that places like ClimateWorks has been tracking over the last couple of years, how do we support Aussie businesses to translate that ambition into action? I'm posing it to the group.
It's incumbent on me to say, well, that's part of our job at the Carbon Market Institute, trying to provide those interactions and networks. But I think it's right. There's a bit of green wishing, if not greenwashing, I think, in some of this work, and people then realising, crikey, this is hard work to get these things through. But we also need governments to provide the extension services. I think it's really important work that Arena, now you got your remit somewhat clarified overnight, the CFC and the CER. I mean, we actually haven't heard a lot of what was the so-called troika there of those three, how they're working to get, a bit of work's happening behind the scenes, but getting that down and having that at a federal level, backing those. But I think it is important with forums such as this, the work that our respective industry associations are doing are really critical, I think, in sharing the knowledge and capacity.
Luke, can I add on that? And I wanted to call from some of John's comments earlier as well. One of the things that, and you see this when you're looking at it from the capital markets perspective, one of the things that's probably one of the most important parts of having a policy, and I hate to mention the policy again, is that it creates demand, right? Yep. And so the chicken and egg conversation we were having earlier, Greta was talking about hydrogen. When you have got a pathway in place, and when you're talking about how do you support organisations to actually do this, creating demand is an incredibly powerful thing that you can do. I remember having conversations with European steel manufacturers a few years ago where they said this was all tick box to us until our major customers came to us and said, you're going to have green steel for us by 2030, aren't you? And that really kicked everything off. And knowing that someone was going to buy that and there was going to be a demand enabled a whole bunch of stuff that we wouldn't otherwise have been able to do because we're sitting in this piece of commercial infrastructure. So we're basically trying to turn capital and technology over faster than we used to go through this transition. And if you have demand, then you can really drag that transformation a lot faster than you'd otherwise be able to.
And also I'd say that there is guidance on how companies can act, sort of Climate Works has just produced some work because we've been looking at net zero commitments for a couple of years now and looking at, what is a good commitment? It's that long-term goal that's in line with what your sector needs for Paris. It's your short-term targets being in line with your long-term goal. It's having implementation plans around these bits, so having that granularity. And it's also thinking about, your broader emissions, so your impact in the supply chain. What are you buying? Who's doing what with what you're selling? Those, what's called Scope 3 emissions. For a country like Australia, it's the equivalent of, our own stuff plus what we export. And, like many companies have the same thing, but Australia, our emissions that we export come from what we export 3 to 4 times what our domestic ones are. So it is really that broad picture, but there is lots of guidance now about it, so there's help out there.
Absolutely. It's a great note.
I was going to echo Anna's, what Anna said about the supply chain influencing up and down. As we get moved further into our Scope 3s, that's where businesses that are perhaps larger, better resourced, more advanced can work with their suppliers and their customers to bring that up. And it's, we've got quite a strong analogy in the evolution of industrial health and safety where that's happened. Certain companies have taken the lead, but then all the contractors that come on site need to have the same, policies, and away you go. So I think using our supply chains and that push for supply chain sustainability will be a strong tool for bringing people up to a level.
And I've really loved over the last couple of years, I've seen, companies like BlueScope, we chatted to Lime in this event last year, talking about it as a partnership with their supply chains. It's not about, wandering around with a big stick. There's expectations, of course, but it's also about, we've developed this literacy internally. We want to share that to support you on this journey because we see you as part of the ecosystem in which we exist. So it's incredible to see that momentum building. I feel like we could talk for another hour without breaking a sweat, but it is my commitment to hand the keys back to Reid at 11:30 AEDT. So with that, I need to thank my panel, Darren, Anna, Greta, John and Zoe. It's been super fun. I really appreciated the chat and what a week to be having this conversation. I wait with bated breath. And I guess to round out the plugs, we can turn up to your summit, John, in a few weeks' time to see where we've all landed once the dust has settled. So looking forward to that as well. Good on you.
Thanks, Viv.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Liv. Everyone.
All right. Well, it now falls to me. It now falls to me to round out this opening plenary for All Energy Australia and Energy Efficiency Expo. I encourage you, if you're not registered for all the wonderful sessions that are taking place over the next couple of weeks, to check out the two relevant websites, which are, of course, energyefficiencyexpo.com.au and all-energy.com.au. It's an incredible program that has been created on both sides, due in no small part, obviously, to the efforts of the team at the CEC and the EEC, but also importantly to the incredible effort and commitment of Reed Exhibitions. Now, it's been a tough couple of years for the clean energy sector, the energy efficiency sector, but you know who it's been tougher for. It's been tougher for the events sector. And the fact that Robbie and Anna Maria and Philippa and the rest of the team at Reed have turned up and put on this digital program for us this year with everything that's going on. It's an incredible commitment to our industry, and one we deeply appreciate. So good on you. We really value the partnership. So I want to commend that program to you. There's a lot of great stuff happening over the next couple of weeks, but more than anything else, I want to say looking forward to seeing you all in person for the joint plenary of All Energy Australia and Energy Efficiency Expo in October 2022. Can't wait to get back into a room with all of you. But in the meantime, have fun with the digital program. Cheers.